When someone says ancient Scandinavia, what comes to mind? Well, Vikings, of course, but you know what? Their era is just one chapter in a long, mysterious, and incredibly interesting book. So, today, in order to see who lived in these lands before the Vikings and how the world from which they emerged actually came to be, let's turn this book back to the very beginning. Hello, everyone. You're on the What Was That channel. And today, we will travel 13,000 years into the past to explore the history of Scandinavia before our era. The settlement of the Scandinavian peninsula became possible only after climatic changes at the end of the Pleistocene forced the ice sheet to retreat. Around 13,000 BCE, the first areas of land, modern-day Denmark, the southern Swedish province of Scania, and parts of the Norwegian coast, became free of ice. This created a harsh but habitable tundra landscape similar to the modern Arctic environment. The flora was sparse, consisting mainly of dwarf Arctic birch and rowan, but it was sufficient to support large herds of reindeer that migrated north, following the edge of the glacier. It was these herds that became the main resource and magnet for the first humans who dared to enter this new world. But right away there's a catch. While it was previously thought that the settlement of Scandinavia was a linear process in which hunters from the south gradually moved north, recent research combining archaeology and ancient DNA analysis radically changes this picture. Thus, according to a study with the romantic title, The Population Genomics of Mesolithic Scandinavia, investigating early post-glacial migration routes and high-latitude adaptation, the first group associated with the Paleolithic Arensberg culture moved from the south. These tribes of hunter-gatherers, originating from the North European plain, followed the seasonal migrations of reindeer, penetrating the territory of Denmark and southern Sweden. But a second, no less important group came from the northeast. Representatives of this group, genetically linked to the population of the Upper Volga region, moved south along the ice-free Atlantic coast of Norway. Analysis of genomes extracted from the remains of Mesolithic people, found in places like the Stora Forvar cave on the island of Stora Karlsö and Gumarabakken Hummervik Holmen, provided irrefutable evidence of this dual settlement. The genetic profiles clearly split into two groups: Western hunter-gatherers who came from the south and Eastern hunter-gatherers from the northeast. These two populations met and mixed on the Scandinavian peninsula, creating a unique population of Scandinavian hunter-gatherers that was genetically more diverse than contemporary populations in Central and Western Europe. This initial melting pot could have become the basis for the cultural flexibility and innovation that would characterize the region's subsequent history. During the Mesolithic era, that is, around 9500 BCE, the climate of Scandinavia again undergoes radical changes. The warming led to the melting of the remaining glaciers, and dense forests began to grow in place of the tundra. This forced the reindeer and the hunters who depended on them to retreat further north. In their place, new ecosystems formed in southern Scandinavia, which gave impetus to the development of new cultures adapted to life in the forests and on the coast. And the first major culture of the Mesolithic was the Maglemosian culture, named after a site in a large swamp in Denmark. Its bearers were masters of adaptation to the forest and swamp landscapes that stretched from England, which was then still connected to the continent by a land bridge known as Doggerland, all the way to Poland. Thanks to the unique preservation conditions in peat bogs, not only stone, but also numerous organic artifacts have survived, giving a vivid picture of their lives. Thanks to this, we can assert that the technological arsenal of the Maglemosian people was extremely diverse. They made complex tools from flint, bone, and wood. A characteristic feature was microliths, miniature sharp flint blades that were inserted into wooden or bone hafts to create arrowheads, spear points, and blades for knives. For fishing, they used bone hooks and barbed harpoons. During the 6th millennium BCE, continued warming and melting of glaciers led to a significant rise in sea level. Huge territories, including Doggerland, were flooded, forcing the population to move to new coastal zones. This change in landscape stimulated the further development of cultures. And so, the Maglemosian culture was replaced by the Kongjamos culture, characterized by long flint flakes and rhombic arrowheads. However, the pinnacle of adaptation to the new natural conditions was the Ertugrul culture, which emerged around 5300 BCE. Its bearers were extremely successful hunter-gatherers who created a complex, largely sedentary society based on the exploitation of rich marine resources. Evidence of their way of life includes huge, multi-layered accumulations of shells, animal bones, and artifacts, sometimes reaching several meters in height. Their fishing technologies were impressive. They built complex fish weirs from hazel stakes, used woven traps, bone hooks, and multi-pronged lysters. Analysis of remains shows that they caught not only coastal fish, but also deep-water species like cod, and also hunted seals and even cetaceans, such as killer whales and dolphins. A key innovation of the Ertugrul culture was the appearance of pottery. They produced characteristic pointed base pots and oval bowls, which were likely used for cooking and food storage. Here, I think it's important to add that, although the technique of making pottery was most likely borrowed, probably from the southern linear pottery culture, the representatives of the Ertugrul culture themselves did not adopt agriculture. This fact demonstrates that the transition to the Neolithic was not an inevitable and unidirectional process. The Ertugrul society achieved such a high level of productivity and stability through its marine economy that early agriculture, with its risks and hard labor, was simply not an attractive alternative for them. They consciously chose technologies that fit into their way of life, rejecting those that required a radical change in their economic foundation. This indicates a high degree of cultural resilience and rational economic choice of this prehistoric community. However, around 4000 BCE, a sharp and fundamental change occurred in southern Scandinavia. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle of the Ertugrul culture gave way to a new agrarian society, known as the funnel beaker culture. This transformation was so rapid that most researchers associate it with the migration of new population groups from Central Europe, rather than a gradual transition to agriculture by the local inhabitants. The bearers of the funnel beaker culture brought with them the entire Neolithic package: cultivation of cereals, breeding of domestic animals, and new technologies such as the wheel and the plow. Analysis of stable isotopes in human remains from that time shows an almost complete abandonment of marine food in favor of terrestrial products, which indicates a radical change in diet and economy. Settlements became more permanent, located on fertile soils suitable for further agricultural cultivation. The most impressive and lasting legacy of the funnel beaker culture is its monumental architecture. Starting from approximately 3500 BCE, these communities began to erect thousands of megalithic tombs, structures made of huge stone blocks. They ranged from simple dolmens to complex passage graves, which were used for collective burials over many generations. The construction of such structures required significant collective effort, coordination of labor, and a developed social organization. These megaliths were not just burial places. They served as centers of ritual life, symbolized a connection with ancestors, and marked the territorial claims of certain clans or communities. That is, they are the material embodiment of a new sedentary ideology, closely tied to the land and ancestral memory. But it should be added that the spread of agriculture was not uniform. While the funnel beaker culture dominated the fertile lands of the south, communities of hunter-gatherers, particularly the pitted ware culture, continued to exist on the islands. They maintained their marine economy, hunting seals and fishing, but at the same time actively contacted and traded with farmers. This period is characterized by the coexistence and interaction of two different ways of life, which created a complex cultural mosaic. And the next major transformation that would forever change life in Scandinavia would occur in the 3rd millennium BCE. Around the 2800s BCE, representatives of the battle axe culture, which was a local variant of the pan-European corded ware culture, appear in Scandinavia. The appearance of its representatives in Scandinavia represents not an evolutionary stage in the development of local societies, but a revolutionary break that radically and irreversibly changed the demographic, cultural, economic, and likely linguistic landscape of the region. This phenomenon marked the end of Old Europe, of Neolithic farmers, and the beginning of a new era characterized by mobility, individualism, and new social structures. If you are interested, we can talk in more detail about the connection between the corded ware culture and the Yamnaya culture someday. But for now, let's focus on Scandinavia. So, despite regional variations, the corded ware culture is united by a recognizable set of material and ideological traits, a so-called package, the key elements of which are pottery, mainly beakers and amphorae decorated with cord impressions, which, by the way, gave the culture its name, finely crafted polished stone axes, and of course the burial rite, characterized by individual burials, usually in a flexed position under barrows or in flat graves. The rite itself was strictly regulated by orientation. For example, in many regions, men were buried on their right side with their heads to the west, and women on their left side with their heads to the east, but both facing the same direction south. As we can see, this package reflects a deep ideological transformation. At the center of the new cosmology is the individual, especially the male warrior, his status, lineage, and personal achievements. And this contrasts sharply with the collectivist traditions of Neolithic farmers, where the individual was dissolved in the community. Little is known about the settlements of this culture, as they were likely small and temporary, consistent with a mobile pastoral economy. At the same time, there is evidence of cereal cultivation, which may indicate a mixed economy. Maritime communications played an important role in the spread of the culture, turning the sea into a highway that connected coastal communities. In Denmark, especially on the Jutland Peninsula, the corded ware culture took the form of the single grave culture. Its name comes from the thousands of characteristic single burials under low, round barrows, which often formed entire cemeteries stretching across the landscape. The grave goods were quite standardized. Men were accompanied by the same battle axes and flint tools, while women had amber necklaces. The appearance of this culture in Jutland is associated with dramatic changes in the landscape itself. Palynological data indicate massive deforestation and the expansion of open pastures, suggesting the dominance of animal husbandry, especially the breeding of cattle, as the basis of the economy. And although these two Scandinavian variants of the corded ware culture have obvious differences, particularly in the construction of burial structures, they are manifestations of a single ideological and genetic tradition. Both cultures share a common genetic profile, indicating steppe ancestry, and share key ideological markers: battle axes as a symbol of status, individual burials, and clear gender differentiation in ritual. The differences are likely the result of adapting this common ideology to different local conditions. For example, the strong barrow tradition in Denmark could have been a symbolic response or a rewriting of the sacred landscape of the preceding funnel beaker culture, with its monumental megalithic tombs. In general, the appearance of the corded ware culture in Scandinavia almost coincides in time with the decline and disappearance of the funnel beaker culture, the region's first farmers. Genetic studies paint a picture of rapid and drastic demographic change. Genome analysis shows an almost complete replacement of the male Y chromosome lineages characteristic of the funnel beaker culture, with new R1A lineages brought by the bearers of the corded ware culture. This suggests that the process was not a peaceful cultural exchange, but rather a rapid transformation, which some researchers describe as a violent clash of cultures. The reason for this clash, in my opinion, lies in economic competition. Both the representatives of the corded ware culture and the funnel beaker culture laid claim to the same resource: fertile lands suitable for farming and grazing. In this competition, the more mobile, warlike, and perhaps better organized social structure of the corded ware people proved to be dominant, which led to the displacement and assimilation of the funnel beaker farmers. A completely different picture was observed in relations with the pitted ware culture, whose bearers were descendants of the indigenous Mesolithic population of Scandinavia. maritime hunters and fishermen who occupied mainly coastal areas, while the newcomers from the steppes settled the inland areas suitable for pastoralism. Their economies occupied completely different ecological niches and were complementary rather than competitive. This created a basis for trade, where pastoral products could be exchanged for sea products. Archaeological finds confirm such exchange. Artifacts of the corded ware people, particularly battle axes, are found at sites of the pitted ware culture. However, despite these cultural contacts, genetic studies have shown that the two groups practically did not mix. Analysis of genomes from pitted ware burials, even those containing corded ware inventory, revealed no genetic influence from the steppe peoples. This indicates the presence of a stable social and genetic boundary between these two communities. Archaeogenetic studies have provided indisputable evidence that the appearance of the corded ware culture in Scandinavia was the result of a large-scale migration. Genome analysis showed that steppe ancestry, associated with the Yamnaya culture, is the dominant component of their DNA. The earliest individuals studied had the highest proportion of steppe ancestry, sometimes over 90%, which decreased somewhat over time due to gradual mixing with the remnants of the local farming population. This migration is the second of two major prehistoric population changes in Scandinavia. The first occurred around 4000 BCE, when the arrival of Neolithic farmers from Anatolia led to the displacement of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. The second, around 2800 BCE, is associated with the arrival of the bearers of the corded ware culture, who, in turn, changed the gene pool established by the first farmers. Imagine two powerful images that define two great eras in the history of Northern Europe. The first is the brilliant, gold leaf-covered Trundholm sun chariot, symbolizing the cosmological and artistic achievements of the Nordic Bronze Age. And the second image is the Roman eagle, the Aquila, which embodies a distant but incredibly influential force that, centuries later, radically changed the North. Hello everyone, you are on the channel What Was That? And today we will find out how Scandinavia transformed from a sophisticated Bronze Age society into a dynamic, militarized machine. Let's start with the fact that the Nordic Bronze Age is not just a period when bronze products became widespread. Social inequality emerged, and elites separated, but also the name of the culture itself, given by archaeologists to the unique way of life that existed in Scandinavia from 1750 BCE. The core of the culture was Denmark, southern Sweden, Scania, and Schleswig-Holstein. The broader cultural sphere encompassed southern Norway, central Sweden, and the southwestern coast of Finland. Cultural unity was manifested in common styles of metalwork, burial rituals, and cosmologies. However, this culture did not arise in isolation. Its roots go back to the late Neolithic, where two key cultures laid its foundation. The battle axe culture, a local variant of the corded ware culture, brought a pastoral economy and new social structures. Subsequently, the bell beaker culture, which spread along the Atlantic coast, brought advanced maritime technologies and early knowledge of metallurgy, which became crucial for future trade. And the real catalyst that transformed these elements into the full-fledged Nordic Bronze Age culture was the influence of the powerful Unitas culture from Central Europe. It was this culture that became the main source not only of metallurgical knowledge, but also of the raw materials themselves, copper and tin, which marked the beginning of the Golden Age of the North. Later, in the final stage of the Nordic Bronze Age, a new ideological impulse came again from the south. The practice of cremation and burying ashes in urns was borrowed from the Urnfield culture, which may indicate prolonged cultural contacts and profound changes in the worldview of the Scandinavians themselves. Thus, the Nordic Bronze Age, though unique in its essence, was in constant contact with continental Europe, creatively reinterpreting external influences and creating its own unique world based on them. At the heart of this culture lay a fundamental paradox. Scandinavia was one of the richest regions in Europe for bronze artifacts, yet it was almost completely devoid of copper and tin. the raw materials necessary for the production of bronze itself. The societies of the Nordic Bronze Age were entirely dependent on external sources of these metals, and this dependence inextricably linked Scandinavia to a vast trade network that stretched from the Mediterranean all the way to the Baltic. Isotopic analysis of metal artifacts, conducted by researchers such as Helle van Kilde, Heide Nørgaard, and Ernst Pernicka, has revealed the dynamic nature of the metal trade and its chronological changes. For instance, in the initial stage, Scandinavia relied on Central German intermediaries from the Unetish culture, who supplied copper with a high impurity content from the Austrian Inn River Valley and the territory of modern-day Slovakia. This metal was supplemented by British metal with a high tin content, which enabled early local production of tin bronze. After the collapse of the Unetice culture around 1300 BCE, a strategic shift occurred. Scandinavian elites established direct access to the Carpathian Basin, obtaining chalcopyrite from the territory of modern-day Slovakia and the Eastern Alps. And after the cessation of British imports, a new shift occurred towards North Italian copper. This new route connected the Nordic Bronze Age culture with the South German tumulus culture and the first Transalpine amber route. In exchange for vital metals, Scandinavia's main export was amber, the gold of the North. This fossilized resin, abundant on the coasts of the Baltic and North Seas, was highly valued in the Mediterranean. The Amber Road, a network of routes that carried this commodity south, directly linked Scandinavia with the economic sphere of powerful civilizations such as the Mycenaean civilization. This trade was so significant that Baltic amber has been found even in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, including Tutankhamun. These extensive trade networks were not impersonal flows of goods, but were maintained through complex human relationships, including strategic marriages and the physical movement of high-status individuals over long distances. The archaeological case of the Egtved girl is a vivid personal example of how this network functioned. Analysis of strontium isotopes in her teeth, hair, and nails proved that she was born and raised in the Black Forest region of southern modern-day Germany. She moved to Jutland and even traveled back home for a time before her death. Her burial, with a unique corded skirt and a bronze belt plate, indicates her high status. The most likely explanation for such a long-distance move of a high-status young woman is a political marriage, arranged to strengthen an alliance between a southern chief who controlled the supply of metals and a northern chief who likely controlled the amber trade. This changes our understanding of the Bronze Age economy. It was not just trade in goods, but a diplomatic and social network, where kinship ties and the exchange of people were as important as the exchange of metals themselves. Extensive trade networks would have been impossible without advanced shipbuilding. There's evidence of complex plank-built boats, sewn with bast fiber, which would have been strong enough for open-sea voyages. This technology, which appeared around 2000 BCE, was a necessary prerequisite for the metal trade. The analysis is based on thousands of images of ships and rock art and on the amazing find of the Hjortspring boat, which, although later than the Bronze Age, is still considered a reflection of a long tradition of this construction style. Recent research by Bengtsson, Arterson, and Abelin puts forward a revolutionary hypothesis about the use of sails in the Nordic Bronze Age culture. Evidence from rock carvings and holes for masts and stone ship settings suggests the possible existence of large sailing vessels. This discovery, if ever confirmed, could radically change our understanding of the range and efficiency of sea voyages of that era. As for society, it became more differentiated compared to previous eras. At its core were chiefdoms, political entities where power was concentrated in the hands of powerful clans or individual chiefs. At the top of the social pyramid was a military aristocracy, whose wealth and power were based on control over trade, especially in metals and amber. Then came the warriors themselves and the commoners, farmers, pastoralists, artisans, and sailors. They lived in small settlements and engaged in agriculture and animal husbandry. Regarding the warriors, The concept of brutal beauty by Danish archaeologist Helle Vankilde is very interesting here. Vankilde's theory is based on the analysis of material culture, particularly weapons, jewelry, ritual objects, and burial complexes. She argues that Bronze Age weapons, such as swords, daggers, axes, and shields, were often not just functional tools for killing, but also works of art. They were decorated with complex patterns, inlays, and symbolic images. According to Vankilde, this sophistication was not intended to hide the brutal nature of the weapon, but on the contrary, to emphasize and glorify it, making violence attractive and worthy of respect. Vankilde's concept also touches on how violence was integrated into social and ritual life. Demonstrative burials of warriors with weapons, battle scenes in rock art, and ritual duels were ways not only to honor the dead, but also to affirm warrior values. The aesthetic design of these practices made violence a part of the sacred and social order. Speaking of religion, the central element of the Nordic Bronze Age religion was the worship of the sun and its cyclical journey across the sky. This belief is most vividly embodied in the Trundholm sun chariot, a bronze and gold sculpture depicting a divine horse pulling a gilded solar disk on spoked wheels. The Swedish archaeologist Anders Sandgren, in his work tracing ancient Scandinavian cosmology, points out that the idea of a horse pulling the sun finds its continuation in Norse mythology. The horses Skinfaxi and Hrimfaxi pull the chariots of the god of day, Dagr, and the giant of night, Not, across the sky. Accordingly, this is a direct mythological continuation of the cosmology of the Nordic Bronze Age culture. This solar cosmology is also further reflected in thousands of petroglyphs, especially concentrated in places like Tanum in Sweden. The dominant motifs are ships, symbolizing the vessel that carries the sun, and spirals, personifying the eternal movement of the sun and life-giving energy. The key symbols of the Nordic Bronze Age religion, the ship and the sun, were not accidental. They were a direct reflection of the two fundamental realities that defined their existence: the daily and annual solar cycle, crucial for agricultural life and sea voyages. Their religion was not an abstract mythology, but a practical and deeply rooted worldview that sanctified the very activities that were necessary for their survival and prosperity. The journey of the sun was a divine archetype for their own perilous journeys, turning every trade mission into a reenactment of a cosmic principle. The transitional period from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, which began around the 6th century BCE, was marked by a convergence of crises. A significant deterioration of the climate led to colder and wetter conditions, which negatively affected agriculture. At the same time, growing conflicts between the Hallstatt and Latin cultures in Central Europe destabilized and eventually severed the trade routes that had supplied Scandinavia with bronze for over a millennium. The cessation of metal imports caused a systemic collapse. The power of the elite, based on control over bronze, was undermined. This is indicated by archaeological data from burials of that time, which show a significantly reduced number of rich metal artifacts. It was at this time, from the ashes of the late Bronze Age crisis, and on the basis of new local iron metallurgy, that a new cultural formation emerged in northern Germany and southern Scandinavia, which became decisive for the future history of Europe. The Jastorf culture appeared. This archaeological culture, which existed from about the 6th century BCE, is considered by many scholars to be the cradle of the Proto-Germanic tribes. This culture was not the result of conquest or sudden migration. It evolved organically from the local traditions of the Nordic Bronze Age and represents a gradual transition as a society cut off from the import of metals needed for bronze production adapted to new realities by relying on local iron. The development of bloomery furnaces allowed for its small-scale local production. And this change had profound social consequences. While bronze production was a specialized craft controlled by elites with access to foreign trade, iron smelting could be done at a more local, even domestic level. This decentralized access to high-quality metal for tools and weapons radically changed the existing power structure. The widespread use of iron tools, plowshares, sickles, axes, revolutionized agriculture, making it more intensive and productive. And this, in turn, led to population growth and the development of larger, more organized rural settlements, which differed from the scattered farms of the Bronze Age. The Jastorf culture is not followed by one specific archaeological culture with a new name. Instead, the Jastorf culture itself and its related groups gradually evolved into what historians and archaeologists call the cultures of the Roman Iron Age. This period lasted from the beginning of our era and was characterized by a profound transformation of the society of the Jastorf culture's descendants, under the enormous influence of the new superpower to the south, the Roman Empire. If the Jastorf culture was a period of internal consolidation and adaptation after the collapse of the Bronze Age, the Roman Iron Age became an era of new globalization, wealth, and wars. Contacts with the continent resumed with incredible force. The Amber Road was working again, but now the main buyer was the Roman Empire. In exchange for northern goods, amber, fur, leather, and slaves, a stream of Roman luxury items flowed into Scandinavia. Archaeologists find thousands of Roman coins, exquisite silver and glass vessels, bronze statuettes, and jewelry. These items were not just goods, but powerful symbols of status. Also, unlike the relatively modest society of the Jastorf culture, where burials contained almost no weapons, the Roman Iron Age saw the rise of a military elite once again. This was facilitated by two factors. First was service in the Roman army. Many Scandinavian warriors, particularly from the territory of modern Denmark, served as mercenaries or in auxiliary troops, the auxilia. They returned home not only with pay, but also with invaluable experience of Roman tactics, organization, and discipline. They brought with them Roman weapons and equipment, which became models for local blacksmiths. And second was the competition for wealth. Control over trade routes and the distribution of Roman goods led to fierce competition among local chiefs. Power now depended not so much on lineage as on military strength and the ability to attract and maintain a retinue of loyal warriors. Society became much more hierarchical. Instead of scattered settlements, central places appeared, large fortified centers where chiefs lived, religious rituals took place, and artisans worked. One could say that these were the first proto-cities that controlled significant territories. It was during this period, as a direct result of contact with the literate Roman world, that Scandinavia's first own writing system appeared, the runic alphabet, the Elder Futhark. The early runes were an adaptation of the Latin or other Italic alphabets for carving on wood and stone. Thus, the culture that replaced the Jastorf was its direct descendant, but radically changed. It was a dynamic, highly militarized, and stratified society, deeply integrated into the economic and political orbit of Rome. It was in this crucible of the Roman Iron Age that all the key elements were forged that would later define the next great era, the Viking Age.